We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell. As soon as we had these two sequences, we thought, if this is supposed to be the smallest genome of a self-replicating species, could there be even a smaller genome? Could we understand the basis of cellular life at the genetic level?
On May 21st, 2010, this historic announcement was made by Craig Venter on the first fully functioning, reproducing cell controlled by synthetic DNA. Every protein of this cell was based on a synthetic code they had developed. As exciting as this was for bringing in a new era of science, the question was posed: then what is life if we can just create it through a code? There are some experts that have suggested that an ancient blueprint was left behind. In 1929, an American archaeologist named Matthew William Sterling began suspecting that artifacts emerging out of Mexico belonged to a time much earlier than the suspected Olmecs. He concluded that these artifacts were actually Mayan. In 1941, Sterling unearthed a large carved stone monument in the Mesoamerican site Izapa of Chiapas, Mexico. He named this Stela 5.
And Stela 5 is a description, it's a sketch of exactly the type of world tree that keeps showing up in different forms all over the world in every indigenous culture you look for. One of the things that's a very common element we see in the Mayan version, which is birds that are nesting in the tree. Then there's also the belief that the upper part of the tree sort of represents the tangible, manifest world, and then the area of the tree that goes below the surface of the earth represents the underworld.
The Mayan tree of life depicts the oneness of humanity, that we all come from the same root and that we've branched out to become many.
The Mayan tree of life may not look like a coded depiction for the human genome. However, researchers started mapping its imagery. They counted 12 human figures, a dozen animals, over 25 botanical or inanimate objects, and 9 stylized deity masks carved into the stone. Given the multiple overlapping scenes, it appears to be a narrative. But what is the narrative? And could Sterling's suggestion that these images belonged to a much older culture be just the beginning of its origin?
Well, let's go back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, there are actually 2 trees of significance. One of them is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which Adam and Eve eat from, thus entering into a state where they may begin to make responsible choices for which they will have to bear the costs. And the other is the tree of life. When the demiurge drives Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he states his motive, and the motive is kind of eerie. He says, this has to be done. They have to be driven out of the Garden of Eden. They've eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The next thing they will do is eat of the tree of life. And then they will become gods like us. That statement is actually in Genesis. What on earth is going on there? What does that mean? Is there some deeply buried secret of transcendence that demiurgic and archonic forces have concealed from us from so long? Is there a tree of life? Is there something beyond what we think of as the span of human life? Some eternity that is offered to us?
One meaning that people give to it is that it was the tree that leads to physical immortality. If you look at the old Mesopotamian writings, one of the big conflicts between humans and the gods was the gods did not want humanity to have immortality. Most people interpret that to be physical immortality, that we live and die too soon, it goes too quickly. And meanwhile, the gods were said to have lived 20,000 years or 50,000 years or longer, so why not humans? And the idea was that humans were perhaps programmed that way to die more quickly, so they couldn't be like the gods. And so the tree of life, by that interpretation, would be that this is the formula, or this is the knowledge for how you attain that much longer time span physically.
One of the greatest mysteries of the Sumerian civilization and the artifacts that have been found from that civilization is the ancient Sumerian kings list. They identified the time of the Great Flood that is almost universal in every indigenous tradition I've ever studied, and the length of time of the rulers from that time until more present times is right on. It is very accurate. And where this gets really interesting, the names of the rulers, the time that they ruled on earth, the lengths of their reigns are all within reason. Prior to that time, we're looking at kings who are said to have ruled for periods of time of thousands and thousands of years. So for example, the very first king listed is said to have ruled for 28,000 years.
Could these Sumerian gods or rulers have been able to live for 28,000 years at some point? Or is this just another meaning for something else carved into the stone?
Another interpretation of the tree of life is that it meant the awareness of spiritual immortality, that humans kind of go through this lifetime, they go through this between lives, and there's a memory loss, and then they get reincarnated, and they've forgotten all the past, and so now they feel like, oh, life is just 70, 80, 90 years, not realizing, no, it's this whole continuum that goes back thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years.
Alors, dans les textes sumériens,
In the Sumerian Eden texts, just like in the Bible, we find two trees: the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. The tree of life refers to eternal life. As far as the truly inaccessible tree of life is concerned, it relates to ways for people to achieve transcendence. This way, people can truly liberate themselves.
The Mayan Tree of Life stone and the Garden of Eden Tree of Life aren't the only references that represent this same concept. In fact, throughout many cultures, it is found depicted in almost the same way.
The Mayan Tree of Life is a very good example of the concept of the cosmic tree, the tree from which life and creation emerges from. It was seen to exist essentially in the centre of the world. Out from it went the four different directions, each of which had four different colours associated with them, and in each of those directions there were different clans and tribes. This shouldn't be seen in isolation, because all the way around the world we have similar ideas of these world trees or cosmic trees.
The tree of life is a symbol that's found in many cultures and civilizations down through history all over the world. The ancient Norse civilization in Europe had the sacred tree Yggdrasil, and they believe it connected the world of the gods with the world of humans and then down to the underworld. The ancient Indian spiritual text, the Bhagavad Gita, speaks of a tree of life with its roots going up and its branches going down. The essential thing to understand is that the real self is the conscious self, and the physical body, be it a human body or a plant body or an animal body, is a vehicle for that conscious self, which originally existed as a divine spark on the higher level of reality. This is one of the main Gnostic teachings. So that means as long as there has been a material world, human beings and other conscious selves have been part of the tree of life here for millions or even billions of years.
If there is a universal tree of life depiction in almost all these different cultures, then how do we decipher the code in its branches?
Hamlet's Mill describes a continuity that seems almost impossible to believe between mythologies all over the world. In fact, they combined 35 different, geographically isolated in most cases, mythological traditions and showed that there was an underlying commonality between them all. Now, one of the common things that you hear about in Hamlet's Mill is this idea of a mill for grinding grain, where there is a central axis, and then you have this millstone with a rod going through it. There's a hole in the middle of the millstone, and you grind it around in circles, and it grinds up the grain into flour. Now, the strange thing is that this mythology shows up in different ways around the world, and one of the most common ways that Santayana and van der Shen talk about is the world tree. So instead of it being the actual axle of a mill for grinding grain, now you have the central trunk of a tree. And the tree is actually something that fits into this same mythological concept that Santayana and van der Shen are talking about. So what is the mythological concept? The myths almost always describe some sort of spontaneous metamorphosis of the human being.
But how does a human form spontaneously? Is it possible that the tree represents an even deeper understanding of how we were created as humans?
According to my research, the tree of life depicts the frequency that DNA oscillates at. Everything is made out of frequency or vibration. The wall behind me is all vibration. You could stick your hand through it if you were able to match that vibration. All genetics have a vibratory signature that can be picked up by technology. And in the secret space programs, they're able to use this type of frequency to detect different types of life just by their genetic frequency.
If DNA has its own frequency, then how can it be manipulated and changed?
We are gods, we forget this connection, and the more you understand that, the more you actually become aware of your position in life. I think that's where the interaction is between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. One leads to the other. Now, if you follow that through in terms of genetics, the more you come to understand who you are as a temple and as a god, you begin to alter the chemical structure of your own DNA. It actually starts to alter who you are. And this is something that we now know in modern physics. So in a way, you can see it as a tree of life because it means that you actually are altering your very own DNA. Your own thoughts and your own belief patterns do alter your DNA. It only takes a small change in the local electromagnetic environment to alter the information received by DNA.
Were the gods afraid that we could be able to manipulate our own DNA? And if so, could the tree symbology be a blueprint for this inevitable knowledge?
The world tree symbology also has a very interesting parallel in actual physics. Only recently have we really started to understand the value and the significance of the torus, the spherical torus. If you have a vector moving through a fluid medium, meaning if you just have a force moving through a fluid, as that force moves, it will naturally cause a torus to form. The torus is the curling of the fluid as a vector moves through it. We see in physical systems like the atom, that the atom is a series of toroidal shells of electrons that are all concentric with a nucleus. In much the same way, the world tree appears to have layers of onion-like shells.
If the tree of life is a representation of DNA on a deeper level, where can this be decoded in ancient texts?
The closest thing I believe on the planet right now that you might be able to come across is the original Hebrew language, which, when you begin to examine it, has 22 letters, matching all of these other ancient occult secrets, and those 22 letters each equate to a number value. And because of that, you can construct words that have a numerical value or a mathematical relationship with their surroundings. I think that's the last surviving kind of piece that shows us what that language was like. And no, it's not perfect by any means, but the fact that you can literally construct mathematical equations out of words and the words make sense, and that these mathematical equations interact harmonically with our surroundings is the great occult secret. That's the occult secret that every occult group has been searching for forever, and the reason why the Tree of Life, for example, where you have 22 paths and each equate to one of the Hebrew letters, is the basis of most of their occult teachings. What we know about DNA today, that they're still discovering new things every single day, but we know that the female and the male human body share 22 chromosomes. The 23rd are the sex chromosomes that make us different. The 22 is what's interesting because DNA is created in a spiral, and spirals naturally transmit fractal energy. What's even more interesting is that when you begin to examine a lot of the ancient cultures who were building these megalithic monuments, for instance, the pyramids at Egypt, there are 22 pyramids along the Causeway of Peace, not the 3 that they always show. There are 22. And when you begin to study the occult, especially the Western occult tradition that came up through the Knights Templar and into the Freemasons and into Crowley's group and the OTO, you begin to learn that the 22 trumps of the tarot also match the 22 paths on the Tree of Life, which also match the 22 pyramids, and they all have the same vibrational frequency. That's fascinating.
Interestingly enough, the Mayan Tree of Life carved into Stela 5 and its depictions throughout Mayan culture also has a strange correlation to the number 22.
When I was in the Yucatan working with the Mayan elders, there was an elder that came out and we were having the conversation, and he said, "It's easier if I show you." It begins with many branches of the tree above, and it represents the 13 heavens that we aspire to. Below, the root system represents what they called the 9 levels of the underworld. 9 hells is what the Western tradition would call them. And the area in between is Earth.
Could the Tree of Life really be a secret code for our physical existence on the planet? Could it explain our material existence in this density?
If you look at the idea that the planets are not just being held by some strange combination of centrifugal and centripetal force, but there is some sort of greater emanation from the sun that's holding them in place because their orbits should not be so consistent over so many thousands of years. And this is what mainstream scientists have said. They've had a big problem trying to figure out why do the planets not lose energy and crash into the sun. I've often modeled this idea that the planets themselves are on spherical layers, that there's a spherical force field holding each planet in place, and that's what determines its orbit. Which means if you looked at our solar system from the perspective of the afterlife, you would see a series of concentric spheres with a central axis, and it would look like a tree. And what I find really interesting about this is that PMH Atwater, in one of her books, describes her own near-death experience, where when she got thrown out of her body into the solar system, she saw a phenomenon of what looked like a series of umbrellas of energy. And the central stalk of the umbrella was where the sun is. Well, that's the world tree. The ancient beings seem to have left behind mythologies like the world tree on purpose, because they get us a lot closer to understanding how physics really works, the ubiquity of the spherical torus in any type of energetic system you're looking at, biological, cellular life, molecules, the energy fields of planets, the energy fields of the solar system, even the energy fields of galaxies appear to have these spherical toroidal shapes in them. So it's a trail of breadcrumbs leading us down a very interesting line of investigation. And when you start to understand this, you can no longer look at these inscriptions and see them as primitive. You say, there's something going on here that's very powerful.
If the ancient gods were afraid that humans would eat from the tree of life, and they were successful, could someone or something have picked up on this trail of breadcrumbs and have created their own version of our DNA? Reporter Linda Moulton Howe discovered some shocking links to specifically the Mayan tree of life and a DNA manipulation.
It was back in the early 1980s. I was in New York. It was another one of those phone calls, can I talk to you about? And this person, a man, said that he had worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, retired. And he traveled with another CIA colleague. And their destination was New Delhi in India. And they were given detailed instructions upon landing at the airport, maps, and he said it was really necessary that they went into this detail. He said, in that work, going to India, knowing that we are dealing with actual preserved material related to ET technology in a body, he said, we also were told that the last major manipulation of DNA in already evolving primates on this planet, exactly as I had seen in that presidential briefing paper at Kirtland, was in Bhutan, in the Himalayas, 5,000 years, different ages. He said, I think the last was 2,500 years ago. And that was the creation of hybrids between Bhutanese and something else, and that we know, and he said, we have proof, that the hybrids in Bhutan were picked up by craft, UFOs, and flown to what we would today call the Yucatan Peninsula on the Gulf of Mexico. Then that was the Mayan civilization created in a hybridized program by even extraterrestrial biological entities, and they were put down in the Yucatan Peninsula to keep them away from every other hybridization program that they had on the Earth, which included putting hybrids in the tops of mountains, putting hybrids on islands, peninsulas, to keep their experiments on the Earth separate. The tree of life, at least this is my just basic understanding, that the tree of life in any culture's history has related to, we'll call it elites, who may have actually been handed information down from something, that we are a created species. But in religions, the creation of humans is allocated to a godhead.
I view DNA as an analog coding molecule. And when we sequence the DNA, we're converting that analog code into digital code. The ones and zeros in the computer, very similar to the dots and dashes that Schrödinger indicated might be the original code. And I've called this process digitizing biology.
If Craig Venter and his institute are correct, does this mean our code is part of a larger database or system? Is the tree of life the representation of the database we live in, or an invitation to free ourselves from the code?
Tree of life has also been sometimes interpreted to maybe mean certain drugs that give you insight. For example, we know that certain drugs were used to gain psychedelic experiences, to try to gain insight into other realms. Ayahuasca is a very commonly talked about drug today, and that the tree of life may have actually been the source of one of these drugs that then gives this insight during life into these other realms.
Interestingly, in ancient Egypt, the tree of life, which is found in many scenes. For example, there's a fabulous scene on one of the walls of the Temple of Karnak at Luxor in Upper Egypt, which shows the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, the inventor of writing. He's the Egyptian counterpart of Enki, as a matter of fact. The god Thoth is beside the tree, and he's writing a name on a little object that's hanging from the tree. And off to the other side, you see the pharaoh Seti I, who reigned about 1400 BC. And what Thoth is doing is he's writing the name of Seti I on the tree of life. What he's saying is, you have been justified in the judgment. Now you have earned the life of millions of years. This becomes all the more interesting when we look botanically at the ancient Egyptian tree of life. It happens that a very good friend of mine, Dennis McKenna, who's the brother of the late great Terence McKenna. Dennis is an ethnopharmacologist. He knows his trees. He's very experienced and knowledgeable in this area, and he's worked on this subject, and he's identified the ancient Egyptian tree of life as Acacia nilotica, which, it so happens, is a tree, the bark of which contains large quantities of the most powerful hallucinogen known to humanity, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which, interestingly, is a natural brain hormone as well. We all produce DMT in the body. A lot of research has gone on into this. What's it doing there? It's present normally in subpsychedelic quantities. But why is it generated in the human body at all, and where is it generated? And there's more and more of a focus on the pineal gland, the third eye, as a place where DMT manifests. It's fascinating that out of the realm of plants, with the molecule DMT involved, the very molecule that is associated with the ancient Egyptian tree of life, we have these teachings of how we are to function in this university of duality, and how we can be nurturing and positive presences in that universe rather than negative ones. How, in fact, we can detach ourselves from the demiurge and approach the realm of spirit much more directly.
Could the tree of life hold a fruit of which we could see beyond our created world? Could these ancient representations give us the tools we need to break our third-dimensional prison? Some experts, like Jack Carey, believe the ancient humans tapped into a tool that defied the ancient gods.
Imagine a species that has developed a language that is so potent that it literally uses the laws of harmonic resonance in order to create instantaneous change in your surroundings.
Up next, the revolt of early man and the Tower of Babel.